Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. To quote one of our guests on today's program, America is the most religious, optimistic, patriotic, rights-oriented, and individualistic nation in the world. Now, is that uniqueness good for America? Is it good for the world? Joining us today are two students and teachers of all things American. Professor Seymour Martin Lipset, author of the recently released American Exceptionalism, A Double-Edged Sword, and Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. The topic before this House is America Exceptional? This week on Think Tank. Our guests today are both graduates of the City College of New York and are both former Harvard University professors. Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset is the author of over 20 books and is the past president of both the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association. He is currently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. Dr. Daniel Patrick Moynihan is the senior senator from the state of New York. Senator Moynihan has worked for 4 presidents in 2 parties and has taught at several leading universities. He is the author or editor of 17 books, including the recently published Miles to Go, A Personal History of Social Policy. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us at Think Tank. Marty Lipset, could we start with you? What does that phrase, American exceptionalism, mean?
Well, the phrase was actually coined, as far as anybody knows, by Alexis de Tocqueville in his great book, Democracy, which is in many ways still the most informed book about America. And in the book, Tocqueville says America is exceptional as compared to other countries, by which he meant it was an outlier, it was different on a number of factors. The thing that interested him most at the time was that it was the only democratic country in the world. And he, coming from France, where the French Revolution had seemingly failed, came to America to try to understand why did democracy work. So
America's different. Is that to be interpreted that America is better? It sometimes is.
Yeah, it's to be interpreted, but it's it's better and it's worse. There are some things which many things in which, if you look at statistics or behavioral patterns, we are at the good end of the scale. But there are some in which we're at the bottom end of the scale. One of them is crime and violence, violent crime. Another is voting. We have close to the lowest proportion of the population voting. But on the positive side, we have more people involved in organizational activities and community activities. We're still the wealthiest country in the world by far. We're the greatest job producer by far. We're the most religious country in terms of church attendance and belief, very much by far. And one could go on in terms of differences between the United States and other countries.
Moynihan, how exceptional are we? You have traveled the world many, many times.
Well, 2 things I might say, if you won't mind a New Yorker speaking for a moment. De Tocqueville actually came here, as Marty knows, as a part of a 3-person commission of the French government to look into our prison reforms. And he was heading for...
He was on a junket.
He was on a junket,
right.
And he had to get out of France,
right.
Actually. It was a good thing.
Oh, yeah.
And he was heading for Auburn, New York, where we had produced the Reformatory, a pretty grim place. You couldn't talk to anybody. You're still there.
Finger Lakes, close to Hobart College.
That's right, sir.
That's right.
Exactly. Your own. But we were innovating. We were trying to improve people who had, as against just punish them. Marty, you might agree that it would be sort of serendipitous that Tocqueville would be looking for a country where crime was seen as an opportunity for reform, as against punishment. But you know, there is something else since Tocqueville, and you surely will agree on this. We are exceptional in that there's not a country, a major country in the world with which we could be compared, on which we do not have stationed American military personnel. American bases. The one exception is France, but France is part of NATO, and we have been protecting France for 50 years, having liberated the place. We have our armed forces all over the world in a peaceful participation in a confrontation with the Soviet Union in the end, began with the German and Japanese empires. That surely is exceptional.
Has that ever happened before in
No.
history?
No, I don't think so. But it ties in with another aspect of exceptionalism. I note in the book that we're an ideological country, that Americanism is an ideology in the same sense that communism or socialism or fascism are ideologies. Richard Hofstadter once said, it's been our fortune or misfortune as a nation to be an ideology. And as part of that ideology...
Fortune or misfortune.
Yeah, because being an ideology leads you to want to change the world. And this is something Americans have wanted to do. They've wanted to be involved. In many ways, up to 1917, up to the Russian Revolution, we were the center of the world revolution. That is the democratic revolution. Democratic revolutionaries from all over the world, when they were defeated, when they needed R&R, when they needed money, came here. Sun Yat-sen did, Kossuth did, Garibaldi did. And this was the place that they wanted to when we wanted to export our values, our institutions. We didn't want to dominate them, but this notion that we should be concerned with, that we want the rest of the world to be democratic, to be decent, is an old American orientation, which other countries, which are historic countries, don't have.
You gave a list of the sort of classic American characteristics, individualism, meritocracy, this whole list that we went through, optimism. Is there a grand theme that could put all these things together that says, well, yes, we're exceptional, here are aspects of our exceptionalism, and if you wanted to put a label on it, is there something that would say this is what unites those themes? Pat, Marty, either?
Marty, your book.
Because I have an idea, but I'm not going to. I want to see if you all.
I suppose you could say it's individualism, democracy, or egalitarianism. Tocqueville stressed the fact that America at the time was the most egalitarian country in the world. By that he didn't mean equal in income or equal in power, but he meant that equal opportunity, but also equal in terms of social relationships. That Americans didn't bow down to others and didn't want people to bow down. In fact, he suggested, he didn't use these words, that personal service is un-American. That Americans don't like to have servants and don't want to be servants, unlike the situation in the hierarchical, post-feudal countries of Europe. And this emphasis on egalitarianism and achievement, getting ahead, I think are the two dominant themes of the United States from which the others tie in.
Pat?
I absolutely agree with that, and yet I don't think you would also say, and it's in your book, that this individualism, some get plenty and some get none, is leaving us at the end of this century, in which we are the wealthiest nation in the world, for real reason, with the largest number of genuinely poor, isolated people. We have a degree of societal breakdown which we never would have expected. A third of our children now are born to single parents. In our 50 largest cities, the average ratio, illegitimacy ratio, I don't think you can say that anymore, so I cancel that, non-marital, is now
It's a whole history of words that have described that. It went from bastard to illegitimate to out of wedlock to non-married. Non-marital, excuse me.
The 50 largest cities in the country, the average is 48%. Now, no society has ever in history had to deal with this. And we are exceptional in this too.
But this pattern, though I agree with Pat about the poverty and the lower level, is at least a Western phenomenon. The province of Quebec is now 1 out of every 2 children in Quebec is born out of wedlock. And in Britain, it's now up to a third.
Listen, I want to come back to this because it's fascinating, but let's just wrap up that thought about what the unifying thought is. You both sort of pointed toward individualism. Pat, you once issued a great cry from the heart to set up a Liberty Party in the world. Is it fair to say that what characterizes America in most of these unique aspects is that it is more free than anywhere else in the world?
Well, alas, that's why it's a think tank. We are more given to asserting individual right to do as you will, and more busybody and nosy about the way people behave. And so that maybe that's quite really consistent. If we were a nation in which we all had these rights, we will be pretty quick to say you're infringing mine.
And we are, you pointed out in the book, Marty, the most litigious people. We are willing to go to court and get lawyers for anything.
I was going to pick up on that because one of the points, the uniqueness about America, is our rights orientation. The Bill of Rights was the only one of its kind until recently. And it said Congress may not do, the government may not do this and that, because one of the characteristics of the founding fathers was they were suspicious of the state. They were anti-state. Madison, who was the principal author of the Constitution, said, how do you get government to control itself? And this was one of the ways. The other way was checks and balances of all kinds. Well, setting up the Bill of Rights meant you can sue for your rights against the government. But it also led to people being concerned with their rights against each other. And this, in turn, produced all this litigiousness. The Canadians adopted a Bill of Rights in 1982. They call it the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And one of the effects of it has been a lot more litigation in Canada.
You are both students of the Canadian experience, aren't you? You have.
I'm a student of Martin Lipset, who is a student of the Canadian experience. Right. But I do say that down here as a member of the Congress, anytime you ask, you got something to think about, you always learn something. You say, what do they do in Canada?
It is sort of a great laboratory, isn't it? I mean, you have a controlled experiment. And you say that difference stems from political history?
From the Revolution. The United States is the country of the Revolution, that made the Revolution. Tocqueville's interest. But Canada is the country of the counter-revolution. The Revolution failed in Canada, the monarchy was preserved, Toryism continued. 50,000 people who were living in what became the United States moved up to Canada because they wanted to get away from the new nation. So Canada formed values which were values of continuity, of more hierarchical. I have what I consider a wonderful story illustrating these differences. About 25 years ago, both the United States and Canada decided to go metric, to get rid of this system of inches and yards and so forth. And you may not know it, but both of them decided, since they're on the same continent, to do it at the same time. They both announced as of a certain date, metric is the legal system. But since you couldn't do this overnight, they gave people 20 years, the country to adjust, each country. Well, if you go up to Canada, you can see that you can drive 100 an hour, by which they don't mean miles. It's all kilometers. You read the Canadian newspapers and the temperature's given in Celsius. Here, there's been no change. And if you ask me what happened, I'll tell you. The Canadians were told to go metric by the government, and they did. Americans were told to go metric, and they didn't. Those Canadians are much more deferential to authority. They have lower crime rates. They listen to their betters,
Marty,
and America doesn't.
Wouldn't you let me phrase it just a little bit of me?
Sure.
That the Canadians were told by their government.
Right.
It's their government, not somebody else's at all, and it reflects what they think is proper. They make that wonderful phrase about, they will say, in the United States, the West was won. Here in Canada, it was negotiated.
Right.
Pat, what you were saying before about this sort of social disarray that I know you're very concerned about, and most everybody by now is very concerned about, is that due to this huge amount of freedom we have?
I would think that. I would think changes in the economy we don't understand. I would first say that in the matter of social policy, American exceptionalism is going to be singular in that I think up until now, I think you'd agree, Marty, most of the sort of social issues we've dealt with, unemployment, old age, and so on, we had European models. They kept there first with pensions in Germany and unemployment insurance in Britain. Got there almost in the last century. We followed on. Now we're facing a new set of situations for which there's no European counterpart. The Europeans are getting the problems that began here. We're going to have to work them out on our own, and I don't think we will do so successfully if we just take as a model something the Europeans might do when they have a different set of social values as regards individual autonomy. We're going to have to work this out in terms of our values of the kind that Marty describes so brilliantly in this book.
The conservatives, I think, would argue that this increase, for example, in out-of-wedlock birth was caused not by too much liberty but by too much government, that you set up a welfare net that is so high that it led to dependency, which encouraged the ability to have out-of-wedlock children. You know the argument a lot better than I do.
Yeah, just to speak here in terms of Marty's book, in the 104th Congress, we repealed for the first time a provision of the Social Security Act of 1935, Title IV, the provision for dependent children. That Social Security Act was really an accumulation of examples we'd learned in Europe and brought in here, and very consciously for a long period of effort. Our country repealed it. This nation. If that's not exceptional, I don't know what is. Can you imagine the Canadians saying there's no more provision for dependent children in Canada? There is now none.
Well, it went to the states.
It went to the states, but the federal government said, bipartisan, we're going to stop this. We started it 60 years ago. Probably was a mistake. Probably caused all our problems. I don't think there's any evidence for that, but there's no disproof either. But it's something that wouldn't have happened in Britain or Italy.
We complain in this country about government being too large and too intrusive. How does it compare to other nations?
Oh, we have the smallest government in percentage terms. The deficit, which people are so concerned about, and I don't like a deficit any more than anybody else, but our deficit is under 2% of the GDP, which is the lowest by far of any developed country. We have the lowest tax rate. Americans complain, and I do too, about their taxes, but taxes in every other developed country with a little bit, well, the Japanese are slightly higher, but all the other countries are much higher. They pay much more taxes, there's a bigger government, they have a smaller deficit. And so that when we have this complaint that this is going to destroy the economy and so on, one has to ask, how come the economies of Europe or Canada have not been destroyed?
Is this argument and this theme being played out in the presidential election of 1996? I mean, Senator Dole is going around using the L word, liberal, by which he means too intrusive government, too big government, social disarray brought about by this kind of liberal permissiveness.
Tocqueville would have taken the word liberal to mean someone who did not want too much of a state.
Right.
Wanted limited powers and didn't have any great confidence in the natural goodness of man, so that is in our Constitution you make sure nobody can get too much done or too fast. As you say, Marty says it takes 3 elections for a revolution around here.
Yes, Speaker Gingrich found out you don't do it in 1 2-year term. For sure, that's one lesson of what happened.
But you know, in response to your question, I think this election is a continuation of a trend which does flow from these basic values and traditions. The Depression, which hit the United States harder than any other country except possibly Germany, resulted in a major change which turned out to be a temperate. That is, an increase in the role of the government. Hofstadter said we had a social democratic tinge in American life for the first time. The war increased it. But then since the war, we've gone through a period of roughly, with all the recessions up and down, of good times, of expanding job markets and so on. And I think this has refurbished the American classic tradition, which is this liberal tradition of being opposed to the state, of wanting small government, small state. And Americans have turned back to this, and I think this is reflected in the fact that
to
the
the
Republic...
old-fashioned liberalism, which we
Right.
would today call what, libertarianism?
Yeah,
I guess.
right, we call it now libertarian.
Right.
But this is... but
Same,
you know,
same Latin root.
no, right,
Liber.
Meaning?
Freedom.
freedom.
Back
You know,
to, back to freedom again.
the Democrats won 5 presidential elections in a row with Roosevelt and Truman, dominated the Congress, and so on. Since 52, you've had a gradual growth in the strength of the Republicans. The high point was 94. But then in 96, President Clinton has joined the ranks. He's moved over to a lot of the, you know, he said the era of big government is over. And then by saying this, he brought the Democratic Party, in a certain sense, back to where it had been before.
He didn't say that at the Democratic Convention.
No, but
he said that in the State of the Union.
In the State of the Union speech, right.
Is the world Americanizing? Is that what we're going to see in the future? By accident or design, we are exporting an ideology, very much the sort of freedom-oriented
I don't
ideology.
know how long that will last. I think, and I would defer to my senior colleague here,
He was one of the people who hired you at Harvard, is that correct?
That's right, and that's why I defer to him.
I
I know how to
understand.
take care of them. It's an old Tammany principle. I mean, he's my district leader here, and I want you to know I am loyal.
And that was quite a group you had up there, James Q. Wilson and Nathan
Well,
Glazer.
the committee that recommended Pat was chaired by James Q. Wilson, and a couple of members of it were Nathan Glazer and myself.
That's
it's
why I'm a loyal.
It sounds a little...
and you co-authored that wonderful book with
Beyond the
Nathan
Melting Pot.
Beyond the
and
Melting Pot.
Glazer,
Which
and the democratic alternative to totalitarianism has been so clear and so desirable that it is now that sort of Wilsonian impulse of ours to say, here, this is the way to behave and to govern yourselves. It is still very much in evidence, but I don't know whether it will survive the retreat of the totalitarian threat.
Well, but the surge of American popular culture around the world, this global culture, I mean, that is, aside from anything military or economic, that seems to be where people want to go.
Yeah, that's more than a half century old now. That started with Hollywood.
Right. There's another thing which is which the rest of the world or Europe is becoming American. You know, one of the ways in which American exceptionalism has been referred to is that we are the only country in the world which has never had a major significant socialist movement or labor party, whereas all the other developed countries have had them. And they've been big, very big. The German Social Democrats were a major party very early in the game. Well, if you look around the developed world now, not a single, and I don't mean most, but I've done some research, not a single socialist party can be called socialist today. Every one of them says you need a market economy. Every one of them has been giving up nationalized property if they have nationalized it. Every one of them is in favor of cutting back on welfare or cutting back on the budget, though they start from a much higher point. Well, you can say that in a certain sense, the United States has not developed a socialist party, which the radicals here and in Europe anticipated, but Europe is developing a democratic party. That is, I'd say what's happening in Europe is that the European socialist parties are becoming like the American Democrats.
And you have written, Marty, that the Republican Party is the only anti-statist party of the major industrial...
Right. It's the only major anti-statist party in the industrialized world. All the other countries, and they see this as the other side of the coin, all the others are to some extent or another welfare state-oriented parties. And as the Democratic Party is compared to the Republican Party. Though, as we said earlier, the Democrats are now seemingly moving back somewhat to what was once their traditional position. One forgets today, you know, people forget all sorts of things about American history, that in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, in running against Herbert Hoover, criticized him for favoring big government and for a big deficit.
Promised to balance the budget.
Right. And the Democrats up to that point were the more the anti-statist party. The Republicans favored what we now call industrial policy, were more protectionist.
Just to wrap this up, Pat, so we've gone in your lifetime from a president who got elected, a Democratic president who got elected by promising to balance the budget, to a Democratic president who is seeking to be reelected by saying the end of big government is over. So have we sort of come full circle?
There are some continuities, and whatever it is, a candidate for president pledges to balance the budget.
Right. All right.
Right.
Thank you, Seymour Martin Lipset, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and thank you. We enjoy hearing from our viewers. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.